A series of unfortunate coincidences leads Paul Carpenter, a mediocre man, to work in a strange company that will soon unlock his hidden abilities and unravel a sinister plan. An elderly man was lured to enter a massive room, looking for his baby dragon. As he turned around, a silhouette of another man declared that whoever closes the door owns the door. The elderly man made a power cord to blast off the door, but it shut. Paul encounters a series of misfortunes on the day of his job interview. His alarm didn't ring, his trousers have a stain, his shoelaces break twice, his bread toaster explodes, he steps on a strange green goo, and the alley he's supposed to take is blocked. As he stands in line with the other applicants, a man named Monty strikes a conversation with him, but Paul doesn't recognize him. Monty bids goodbye, and the applicant returns to his line. Unfortunately, a dog bites Paul's scarf and runs off, so he chases after it, leading him to an empty alley where he finds a hiring establishment. He spots another applicant, Sophie Pettingell, so he approaches her to ask questions about the job interview. The woman snobs him, so Paul sits on the other end of the couch. Moments later, a company employee, Dennis Tanner, calls Paul, who's shocked upon realizing the man knows his information despite him not disclosing any. He introduces Paul to the board members, and the CEO, Humphrey Wells, greets him warmly. Countess Judy asks Paul to talk about himself, but nothing about him stands out. Countess asks why he's the best for this position, so he responds that it's pure coincidence. So Paul relays all the events this morning. Professor Van Spee asks him about his hobbies, and Countess resumes asking random questions to get to know him, but Paul gets distracted while sharing that he used to paint goblins and trolls. Casimir asks him in German, but he fails to comprehend and pay attention due to what he's glancing at, so Humphrey grabs his attention. Paul tells him that the cracks on the wallpaper are the map of London and explains every detail he sees. Dennis ends the interview and escorts him out. Upon returning home, Neville, his roommate, informs Paul he's moving. The two bicker since Paul needs to cover all the expenses, unaware that a monster-like hand inserts a letter by the door. Paul reads the letter and discovers that he got the job as an intern. The following day, everything goes as planned for Paul, and he arrives at work on time. The receptionist, Rosie, purposely greets him with hostility. Rosie gives Paul a last chance to back out before calling his direct boss, Dennis. The boss addresses her mom and immediately corrects himself by calling her Rosie. While waiting, Paul asks Rosie what the company does, but she refuses to answer and hands him a mug of coffee with a print destined to be average. Dennis appears and grunts in disappointment upon seeing him, but he asks the intern to follow him. He suddenly pauses upon seeing a stapler in the hallway and cautiously walks past it. The boss tours Paul around the company without a care if the intern can follow his explanations about their work. The only time the boss slows down is to strictly leave the facilities at 5 o'clock. Then he leads him to their office to introduce another intern, and he meets Sophie again. Due to nervousness, he keeps on talking, so the woman cuts him off by saying she hates the smell of coffee. Paul jumps to his seat upon seeing a baby dragon, freaking out his colleague. Then Rosie appears, giving him rolls of maps and instructing him to mark places with bauxite, a mineral used to make aluminum. Sophie asks what she's about to do, so she's told to assist Paul. Offended to be the assistant of someone incompetent, she highlights that she's from the fast track program and has no time for foolishness. They find nothing on the maps, and Paul invites Sophie for lunch, but she refuses and comments that she wants a cup of coffee, which confuses her since she hates it. Countess shows up to instruct Sophie to assist her while telling Paul that he can tag along. A canister pops from a manhole, and the Countess reads a note. She tells them that a woman in the park is Delia. Countess instructs Sophie to signal her if the novel character Cecilia has fallen to the fountain, so the woman stands far from Delia and realizes she sees the words the lady reads. She gives the signal, and Countess uses magic to outbalance a man sitting on the fountain. Delia rushes to assist him, and the boss praises Sophie. Countess reveals that the strangers are destined to be together, and this coincidence will be an endearing story they'll pass on. She explains that their department controls a client's mind or instinct to arrive at the correct decision, so she needs the exceptional Sophie. Paul returns alone to their office and chomps a sandwich. The crumbs drop on the paper, and he wipes them off. Suddenly, he hears a soft buzz of electricity from his hand. Humphrey appears and instructs him to stare ahead while hovering his hand over the map. A strike of electricity hits a point on the paper, so he marks it and gets dragged by the CEO to his office. Paul takes the chance to confirm his understanding of what the company does, so Humphrey explains that they access humans' instincts for them to be on a better path. The intern asks why, and the CEO states it's his concern too since they get no benefit from it. In the office, Humphrey shares about Project Fineprint, the company's most daring influence campaign. The CEO reveals that Paul is the key to commence the project since he's a diviner. Without explaining what it is, Humphrey comments his parents must have been proud, but Dennis interjects. He states that the intern's parents aren't aware he's alive ever since the father lost him at a fair when he was 6, and his mother became busy with her affairs. Humphrey shares a story about his father forcing him to make a contract promising he won't betray his father, or his dad will take his soul, and that contract has been kept in his father's pocket to remind him of his promise. Humphrey assigns the intern to look for his invaluable possession, which can disguise itself and refuses to be found. He clarifies it's a portable door and the key to Project Fineprint. Before he leaves the office, the bosses remind Paul to keep this a secret from everyone. The intern starts his job by touching the walls and calling the door. Van Spee appears and asks what he's looking for, but he tries to keep it a secret. She reintroduces herself, emphasizing that if anything happens, he should report to her. Paul gets distracted due to the strange movement of the woman's hair, while she praises Humphrey and adds that she hopes the intern gets to see the CEO's real identity. Her hair forms the word beware before bidding Paul goodbye and reminding him to go home. Meanwhile, a door opens and shuts somewhere in the building before disappearing. That evening, Paul wakes up startled as Casimir stands before him. The board member interrogates Paul in the dream about the job Humphrey has given him. The intern lies to him, so Casimir bends his foot forward, makes his teeth fall and enlarges both ears. In fear, the intern discloses the truth about the portable door and asks why the CEO would want it. Casimir answers that there's an alternative way to enter the Bank of the Dead, which confuses Paul. The following day, Sophie enters the reception area and sees Rosie kissing the stapler that Dennis is wary of. Meanwhile, Paul resumes his mission and sees a note made of staple wires pointing to the Bank of the Dead. He goes down a spiral staircase and sees a door with a note for goblins only. He discovers a closet, but Dennis arrives, scolding him for not having permission to be in this area. The boss warns him that he has to quit now because Humphrey will punish him if he fails. Meanwhile, Countess receives another canister from a manhole, and Sophie asks who delivers those notes. The boss explains that goblins have been working for them because they're obsessed with meddling with humans' affairs, so their company uses this to set up coincidences. They return to the office, and the boss informs her that John Wells, Humphrey's father, suspiciously vanished on the same day Dennis's father did. Therefore, they think the two sons are up to something, and hiring Paul is somehow connected. Sophie defends Paul, but her words mysteriously get cut off as she doesn't know what to say. Countess meaningfully comments that she seems to have two instincts that fight with each other. After trying to find the portable door, Paul returns to their office and overhears Dennis and Sophie arguing. The woman declares that ever since she signed the contract, she's been a contradiction to herself. The boss leaves angrily after scolding the two for not leaving the facilities yet. As they head out, Paul confirms if the seer plans to quit, and she says she may consider it based on the course of events. Sophie stops as she craves the licorice Rosie places on a table in the lobby. The seer chomps the food but soon feels like throwing up, so Paul invites her for a drink. In the restaurant, Sophie exclaims she doesn't understand why she craves something she hates. Paul comments that she seems miserable, but the woman takes offense and insults how pathetic her colleague is. However, she reads his mind and discovers he's doing something else. Paul shares that he's assigned something special, but it's a secret. Sophie warns him about Humphrey, but the diviner defends him. Sophie shares about the missing John Wells, but Paul comments that she's jealous that the CEO prefers him over her. The seer spouts insults on how mediocre and worthless he is. After an awkward silence, they separate, and Paul returns to the company. Rosie mocks him about the tragic date, and the diviner heads to the goblin closet. Monty blocks him by the staircase and asks him not to go to the basement, which piques Paul's interest. So the man pleads with the diviner to keep his slip of the tongue a secret from Dennis. Paul negotiates to keep it a secret if he can go there. Moments later, the intern enters the closet and passes through a wall. He unravels a basement filled with mystical things and creatures. Then, he sees the stapler again. He tries to hold it, but his hand reveals a goblin pointing somewhere. The electric buzzing on Paul's hand increases, so he hovers toward a wall and finally discovers the door. He He touches the knob, which fully reveals itself. Paul enters it and finds himself in the hallway before Humphrey's office. Shockingly, the door turns into a towel. Then, he overhears the CEO's plans to control people's instincts. A footage of Sophie is shown to his clients, where she is interviewed about things she hates and how Humphrey controlled her to do those things. Paul panics as the meeting ends and summons the door to no avail. He notices a tag on the towel with instructions to say knock knock. The diviner whispers supermarket before entering the door, and he finds himself inside a fridge of drinks in a random supermarket. He returns to his office and is shocked when Sophie initiates to clear their misunderstanding. He looks at his employee ID and notices a camera, so he throws both of their IDs out of the building. He vaguely explains about the flow of events. He shows the towel, which the seer takes as a joke. So Paul summons the door and opens it, leading to an unknown room. Suddenly, a man's voice echoes, begging to wait, but the interns hurriedly leave. Paul closes the door and reads the towel tag stating to announce the destination before opening. This time, he announces his flat, so the door takes them there. Sophie becomes excited, and Paul attempts to initiate a discussion about what he's overheard. However, the seer disregards him and invites Paul to various places. Soon, the two travel around the world while keeping it a secret and proceeding to their regular jobs. Not long after, they become close, and Paul suggests they stay far away together. Sophie confesses she likes him too, but is uncertain because she doesn't recognize herself anymore due to her job contract. The diviner tells her that they can destroy the contract so that the seer can verify if what she's feeling is real. They return to the office, and Dennis barges in. The boss probes about their beach attire and notices the sand on the floor. He frantically warns them to open the door to a faraway place and never return. After Dennis leaves, Sophie agrees to go, but Paul insists on retrieving the woman's contract. That night, Paul and Sophie use the door to get to Humphrey's office, but they're led to the printing room instead. The stapler suddenly appears on the ground, and Sophie reads the terms and conditions of the contracts being printed. She notices that these are from various circumstances, like a train ticket and a gym membership, so she's puzzled why the company collects these. Meanwhile, Paul follows the stapler, which leads him to another room where a shadow lurks and various thumps, laughter, and grunts are heard. As Sophie arrives, Paul uses the door to bring them to the CEO's office, but it leads them to a one-way entrance to the Bank of the Dead instead. The seer checks the contract she kept from earlier and concludes that Humphrey uses various terms and conditions to fool people into agreeing to sell their souls to him to grant complete control of their wishes and instincts. They follow the sound of grunts and thuds and finally sees a group of goblins. They run from the creatures and find themselves hugging each other. Just as they're about to kiss, a spotlight hits them, and Dennis's angry voice echoes. As the boss steps forward, they realize he's a goblin himself. Dennis complains of how stubborn Paul is in disregarding his advice despite his efforts to care for the diviner since he was separated from his parents. He demands to take the door, but Humphrey arrives. Dennis argues that this is his domain, but the CEO shows dominance by emphasizing that he supplies the entire clan with their resources. Then, Humphrey turns some goblins into office supplies while the interns activate the door. Just as Sophie is about to announce a destination before opening, the CEO commands her to stop talking, so the two fall into the unknown room. Humphrey declares that whoever closes the door keeps the door before shutting it closed. Soon they hear a man speak, asking if they have the door, but upon finding out they don't, he resumes reading. The interns ask for a way out, but the elderly man says they're in the nether and there's no way out. Paul concludes he's John Wells and mentions possessing the contract containing Humphrey's soul. John explains it's useless because he has to bring it to the Bank of the Dead for it to work. Meanwhile, the CEO has begun commanding the goblins to transport the contracts to the bank using the portable door. On the other hand, Paul is persistent and looking for a way out, but he returns to the nether no matter what door he enters. Paul hears a buzzing sound from his hand and hovers over the doors. He stops on one of them and opens it, finally leading to somewhere, so he calls his companions. They exit in front of their office building, and John celebrates his freedom. He says that Paul may be more than just a diviner, but he cuts off his explanation. frustrating the intern. Rosie warmly greets John but informs him he may be too late. The Great Wizard gives the interns Humphrey's contract and accompanies them to the Bank of the Dead while instructing Rosie to get her husband. They proceed to the Goblin tunnels and witness many contracts being transported. John instructs the interns to focus on depositing Humphrey's soul contract. Unfortunately, their hiding place is blasted by the CEO. The father and son face off, and the interns rush to enter the bank. However, the goblins stop them due to Humphrey's commands despite Dennis's orders to release Paul. Sophie uses telepathy to ask for help from Countess, but a goblin interrupts her. Paul attends to her, but he's caught in a net and subdued by the creatures. He calls Dennis for help, but Humphrey threatens the goblin. Rosie arrives with a stapler and sees the commotion. She yells that the stapler is Arthur and throws it into the air. John shoots it with his magic, and the stapler transforms into the real goblin leader. Arthur commands everyone to stop. Then, Rosie reunites with him as she turns into her goblin form. Dennis happily welcomes him, but Arthur isn't thrilled. John gladly watches the reunion, but Humphrey uses the chance to land a blow on his father. As he petrifies him with magic, Paul runs with the contract in his hand, but the CEO shoots him. Countess, Vansby, and Casimir convince Humphrey to stop, but the man is defiant. The CEO commands Paul to bring his soul contract and petrify Sophie with his magic. He adds that he'll shred it in front of his dying father so that the last thing he sees is him breaking his control over him. As Paul trudges forward, Sophie speaks with him using telepathy, encouraging him to explore his abilities just like what he's done in the Nether. Paul hovers his hand in front of him and sees numerous doors. He finds one that he places below him at the entrance of the Bank of the Dead. The door opens and he falls into it, and those around him only see him vanish. Paul finds himself in the bank, and the teller calls the next client. She declares that the diviner shouldn't be here for the next 142 years. He gives her the contract as a deposit, but he suddenly interrupts her to propose a trade instead. In the real world, Humphrey suddenly loses his powers, and the board members assist John. The Great Wizard petrifies his son and instructs them to open the door. Sophie opens it to the Nether while the goblins excitedly watch. The son mumbles a plea for his father's mercy. Just as John's heart softens, Countess reminds him that it's his duty, so he commands Humphrey to go. Sophie closes the door and everyone celebrates. John takes the towel and rips the tag, stating that this door is unusable forever. The seer asks about how Paul can return, and a door from somewhere suddenly opens, revealing the diviner. Sophie rushes to him, and the two hug each other while cheers echo. Paul returns her contract, and the seer realizes what she's feeling is her free will, so she kisses Paul. Paul has something in mind, so he leaves the building and throws the towel to a laundry company collecting linens for the day. Then the couple is summoned to the CEO's office, where John and the board members are waiting. Arthur reassures them that Dennis won't bother them again, and John proposes a job for Paul in the Lost and Found division, which he accepts, but complains to in the back of his mind. Sophie giggles, and he asks if she's reading his mind now. The seer refuses to answer, so he says there's a bug on her forehead, making her slap herself. Paul confirms his hypothesis, and telepathically asks Sophie if she feels the same way for him. Before she can answer, John tells her that she'll be the vice president of the Department of Coincidentally. Paul and John ask her simultaneously if she feels the same and if she'll take the offer. Finally, Sophie says she does, relieving Paul. Unbeknownst to them, at a certain hotel, a housekeeping attendant grabs the towel with a label of J.W. Wells & Co. She stops in front of a door and states she's from housekeeping, before saying, "Knock knock."
Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.